But we also saw that sometimes even people sort of in good faith, people who are trying to investigate something or engage in some sort of good faith in pursuit of the truth, they too might fall short in various kinds of ways of this goal. And we've all seen, shared inquiry and shared discussion tends not to go great. We've been on Twitter or on Facebook or whatever, turn on the news. We can see lots of instances where inquiry sort of fails and goes wrong. Now, what we've been doing this throughout the semester, we've been looking at sort of logical mistakes that people tend to make that can cause people to fall astray from the truth. We were calling these fallacies. But usually just pointing out to someone, hey, you committed a logical fallacy, that's not going to get a great response. That's usually not going to solve the problem, because usually when an inquiry goes wrong, there's more going on than just a logical mistake. And that's why I wanted us to end with chapter 11. That's what we'll talk about today. What are some other things going on? We're going to call these biases, psychological, social, cognitive biases, features of how our brains work, features of sort of how our emotional lives work, features of how social groups work that can also interfere with inquiry. And usually when a logical mistake is occurring, it is occurring sort of in concert with one of these other things, one of these various sorts of biases. And if you want to actually carry out a good inquiry, you can't just fix the logical mistakes. You've also got to be aware of these potential biases, the potential danger they serve, and try to mitigate and protect against that danger. So that's how we'll sort of end up the semester with. Most of today we'll spend doing the week 14 in-class activity. That's where we'll turn in just a second. So I'll be on the whiteboard. We'll just go through these problems. The exam is going to cover the chapter 6 stuff. So the appeals to authority, the statistical inductive argument stuff that we talked about right before the Thanksgiving break, and then the stuff we're going to talk about today. So that'll be what's on the exam. For you all, your final exam is going to be on Tuesday. You'll have the entire day to do it, so the whole day will be the window. And my guess is the exam will take you about an hour. It's still not completely finished, but that's my guess is right now it should be about an hour is the length of time you'll have to finish it. So I think that's all I have sort of as a preamble introduction. Does anyone have any questions, comments, thoughts about anything before we get started? All right, then let's begin the week 14 in-class activity. Let's treat this as much as my goal at least is to treat this as much as possible like a normal class. So week 14 in-class activity due by the end of the day. We're going to go through it collectively. So feel free, copy down the answers or whatever. Just make sure it's turned in to me by the end of the day. All right. Again, remember, you can send me stuff by chat if you have questions in that way. You can also feel free to unmute yourself if you prefer. I'll probably be able to respond a little bit faster if you have any questions as we're going through anything. So let's just begin doing the first question together. So on the week 14 in-class activity, every single one of the first 6 problems, so they all have the same basic structure, there's some bias is being demonstrated, either a psychological bias, so some sort of like emotional proclivity that's getting in the way of the argument. There's some sort of maybe a social bias, some way or dynamic about how groups function that's getting in the way, or there's some sort of cognitive bias. There's some feature of how our brains work that's getting in the way of inquiry. So for the questions of this sort, all you have to do is just identify the bias. And so for 1 through 6, that's sort of all you need to do. Identify the bias and then give, a 1 or 2 sentence explanation of why this exchange is indeed showing the bias or manifesting the bias. Frequently, multiple biases could be used to sort of characterize it. So that's why the explanation is going to be really important, that you sort of explain your work, justify your work. So let's look at this first one. So the belief in the existence of God is plainly irrational. There are numerous arguments that can be made to prove that God does not exist, given by notable philosophers and physicists. What do those who believe in God have to offer? Just blind faith. All right. So, we could characterize what's going on here in purely logical terms as a logical fallacy. This would be the straw person fallacy, because indeed there are many people who are religious who would indeed give arguments in favor of the existence of God and not simply offer this blind, right, lack of faith without an argument, faith without a reason. Okay, so we could characterize it that way, but there's other things going on too besides the logical mistake. In this case, what we're looking at here is what psychologists call the my-side bias. And so let's treat this almost like we were picking out a logical fallacy or something. So I'll just define what my-side bias is. This is the tendency of people to not be aware of the arguments and reasons people have for believing things that disagree with their pre-existing beliefs. And so in this case, that's very much what we see. We see someone who is clearly an atheist or maybe an agnostic or something, who is simply not aware of the reasons those who believe in God have for believing in God. And as someone who this person is presumably aware of, maybe heard arguments from philosophers and physicists that they found compelling. But as someone who teaches philosophy of religion and medieval philosophy here at CSU, I can promise you many people who believe in God, philosophers, physicists, theologians, they also have arguments in favor of why they believe that God does exist and why it's rational to believe that God does exist. And if we were to carry out a real rational inquiry into the question, we would have to analyze the arguments for why God doesn't exist, contrast those with the arguments for why God does exist, and see which arguments we ultimately find more compelling. But we can't do that in this case because this person literally doesn't know what those arguments are, doesn't know why people believe God exists, and so therefore just assumes people are being irrational. That's a sense of this blind faith that means sort of like irrational faith, faith that doesn't have an argument or justification for it. And so that's how we would sort of explain then specifically why is this argument showing the my side bias. The speaker is unaware of why people are of arguments people would give to justify their faith in God's existence. And as a result, just assumes other people are being irrational. And notice that would very likely lead into a kind of straw person fallacy, a kind of unintentional misrepresenting of the view of people who believe that God, does exist, because he's simply not aware, or the speaker in this case is not aware that that misrepresentation is even taking place. So something like this is what I'm going to be looking for in the exam for questions of this sort. Maybe you can make the explanation even a little bit shorter, but something like this: identify the bias, explain what the bias is, explain how it's being demonstrated within this particular argument. So does anyone have any questions, thoughts, comments about anything going on in this first question? All right, so now let's give you a chance to work on some of these too. So why don't you take a minute or so, look at number 2, try to identify the bias and sort of come up with an explanation for why the bias is being committed within number 2. All right, so let's talk our way through this one. So again, if we wanted to, we could characterize number 2 as a logical fallacy. We could say this is sort of an anecdotal evidence fallacy. That this sort of, you could read this as a kind of hasty generalization, or your kind of generalization. In general, poverty isn't a success to people's lives, and the person's evidence for that is their own individual experience. So we could call that the anecdotal evidence fallacy. But again, that anecdotal evidence fallacy is not just occurring in isolation or in some abstract space. It's occurring for, in this case, cognitive features of how human brains work. Right? In this case, what we're looking at is also an example of what gets called the representative bias. This bias is our tendency to assume that other people's experiences are more or less the same as ours. And in and of itself, this tendency isn't even a bad thing. this tendency is actually quite useful in a lot of cases. If I touch something and it's really, really hot and hurt my hand, I'll warn you not to touch it because I'm just going to assume that you'll have the same experience that I did. Right? That my experience of the object being painful to touch will be similar to your experience of the object being painful to touch. What can make this tendency dangerous, though, in some context, is that it can cause us to almost just dismiss other people's experiences that have been very different from our own. And that's what we see taking place in this example. Right? Without dismissing this speaker's maybe experience, many other people have probably had very different experiences of poverty. And the speaker is just not taking into account those other people, those experiences, not treating them as evidence. And again, this is going to necessarily sort of, in a lot of cases, lead into kind of anecdotal evidence fallacy, right? I mean, you can sort of see how, because of this tendency, people are going to make the logical mistake, right? They're going to overprivilege their own experience. How are people doing with number 2? Again, any questions, any thoughts, any comments? Also, if anyone has another bias they want to try out that they thought was that also present in the argument, let me know and we can look at that too. So any questions, comments, thoughts? All right, then let's move on to number 3. Again, take a minute or so, look at number 3, then we'll go over it together. All right. So this was something I actually, as a real world case, I was listening to a podcast and I heard this was from a woman who was in her 60s, who was one of the first generation of female editors in newspapers. And she was talking about how she thought it was really important that women dress a certain way professionally as part of their sort of professional life. And again, we could render this sort of claim that's being made kind of as a logically bad argument. Maybe this is the fallacy of popularity or something like that. But again, there's more sort of going on here than just that, or there's sort of biases that sort of explain why, in this case, a social bias, a way that groups sort of work. This is what's called inside the box thinking. And so what is this bias? Right? This is the tendency of people within a group to sort of almost not recognize that traditions or customs that are sort of part of how the group defines itself are indeed traditions or customs. Or they don't see them as things that are in need of justification. Again, this isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it can interfere with inquiry in some cases. There's lots of traditions people have, lots of customs people have. And again, you can think of what I mean by groups here. We can think a lot of different things. We can talk about, like, maybe if you celebrated Thanksgiving with your family, I'm sure your family has certain traditions, customs that they follow. But also a workplace is kind of a group, and a workplace too has certain kinds of traditions and customs that people follow. And having these traditions and customs isn't in and of itself a bad thing. But the problem would be if you didn't recognize that those traditions could be changed, or that they're things that you would need to justify. If you use sort of the sheer fact of having a tradition as itself justification for why the tradition is right, And that's what we see taking place here. Right? The fact that certain dress conventions were dominant in the past doesn't mean that those customs should be preserved. But to the speaker, they just seem as if they're obvious, as they're things that it almost wouldn't make sense to do anything other than them. And it's sort of that's sort of the heart of the bias. It's just these things start to seem so obvious and inarguable that they can no longer be argued or investigated. And then that just sort of shuts down the inquiry before it can even begin, makes it so that the inquiry kind of can't even start because someone doesn't see there as even being something that would need an inquiry. How are people feeling in this particular case? Again, any questions, thoughts, comments on anything? All right, then let's keep moving on. Let's go to number 4. All right, so here we can't even really characterize this as a fallacy, I don't think. Here we just have an inquiry not even get started, an inquiry fail from the jump, right? Why has the inquiry failed in this case? Well, here it would be because of the psychological bias of defensiveness. Defensiveness is a tendency to interpret criticism or critique as personal attack. And the important thing here is even where it actually isn't. Because in this case, person A is not really talking about person B's quality as an individual at all. Right? What's person A talking about? They're talking about the evidence and the conclusion of a paper. Right? So they're talking about sort of like an object in the world, a thing that we can investigate. Is the evidence adequate for the conclusion? Person B makes it all about them. They move it away from talking about the paper to talking about their qualities. And so that's how this is being manifested here. And so you could maybe say this is a kind of straw person fallacy, I suppose. That wouldn't be unreasonable, sort of a misrepresenting of what person A said, perhaps. But the more urgent problem isn't even that misrepresentation. The urgent problem is this defensive attitude or defensive posture that person B has adopted because they sort of weren't comfortable listening with critiques of their ideas. And in the face of such sort of a hostile response, inquiry is just not going to be able to go anywhere, not going to work. How are people doing here? Any thoughts, questions, comments? All right, then let's keep moving on. Let's go to number 5. All right. So here, what we're looking at is what's called ideological fixity. So let's sort of define what we mean by an ideology is basically a framework for interpreting the world. And these ideologies or these frameworks, they're not bad in of themselves. Indeed, in many cases, it can be very helpful to have frameworks that you can use to sort of navigate through the world successfully. So in and of itself, fine. So it's not just adopting the frameworks, it's a tendency to adopt the frameworks and then almost forget that you've done it. You can think of it as applying the framework without worrying about whether it's actually applicable in some specific situation. And that's what we see manifesting here. It's this later tendency that's the worry, because the result, if you fall into this mistake, if you apply it willy-nilly, you no longer see the framework itself as something that's in need of justification. You no longer sort of feel yourself required to say why it's the right framework for this particular situation. And that's what we see here, right? Person B is adopting, so if you call it maybe like a hawkish foreign policy position, sort of a militaristic one, and doesn't feel the need to actually justify why that approach is actually helpful and relevant given the specific crisis at play. For this specific, say, crisis in Sardinia. You could think another way you could think about ideological fixity. It's almost as if what you have the danger here is that you have someone who already knows the answer before they ask the question. That the ideology or the framework becomes sort of this universal answer that it doesn't even matter what you ask anymore. It's sort of a way of shortchanging or short-circuiting an inquiry before you even start. Because if you already know the answer, why would you ever actually investigate? You see this all the time. I won't name names or anything, but various cable news personalities, maybe, right? And you listen to them talk, and you sort of know what they're going to say about today's news before they even say it, because they always say the same thing about everything, right? They always have the same ideological framework. They always apply that ideological framework in the exact same way. And so you almost don't even need to listen in to know what it is they're going to say. They're going to say the same thing about whatever the topic is. That's an example of ideological fixity. Real inquiry just isn't possible if you already think you know the answer to a question before you've even started. All right. How are people doing here? People good with this one? You could maybe also characterize this as a desire for certainty. That person B sort of just like wants to have this, like, how do I deal with international affairs questions sort of figured out. That's fine. I could sort of see that case being made. I do think ideological fixity is a little bit stronger. It's diagnosing maybe like the specific way in which they're desiring certainty. They're desiring certainty through this kind of ideology. All right. No one has anything else. Let's turn to the last one of these first set of questions. So let's do number 6. All right. Here we see an example of the cognitive bias. It's called the overconfidence bias. And this is our tendency to either believe things more confidently than we should, based on the evidence, or to hold more extreme views that are supported by the evidence. And this sort of emerges because sort of when humans act, we sort of have to act in an all or nothing way, right? We sort of have to like be fully committed to whatever it is we're doing. I either have to drink this cup of coffee or I have to not drink it. There's no like middle ground exactly there, right? Either I'm going to drink it or I'm not going to drink it, practically speaking. And so we have a tendency to make our beliefs sort of correspond to be sort of all or nothing. But that's actually, our beliefs don't have to have that character. Our beliefs could have the character of I should drink some coffee, but not too much, maybe, right? And that I can't do with the drinking this particular cup, where I'm either going to drink some coffee or I'm not going to drink it. What we see in this case is the second version, the sort of the holding the more extreme version of the view. Here, the evidence supports the view that drinking too much coffee is bad. Or dangerous, perhaps. And what belief does that support? It would support the belief probably that therefore I probably shouldn't drink too much coffee, right? I mean, the study was like 8 cups a day or something. That's quite a bit, right? So maybe I should drink a bit less coffee. Perhaps that belief is supported on the basis of this evidence. But person A interprets that evidence as supporting the claim that you should never drink coffee. Coffee is deadly. And the problem is it just doesn't support that view. The evidence doesn't actually come to that conclusion. It's a more extreme conclusion than is warranted by the evidence. And so therefore the person is sort of just not coming to the right conclusion. They're coming to too harsh of a conclusion, or they're more confident and they're also more confident in their conclusion than they should be. All right. And again, any last questions, thoughts, comments on number 6? All right, so there will be problems on the exam that look just like the ones we just went through, where your only task will really be to identify what sort of bias is being evidenced in some exchange, and then give kind of a justification, more or less, 1, 2 sentences, sort of like I did, of why that bias is indeed present in the conversation. So you can use the same basic format, right? Like, what is the bias? How is it being present in this specific conversation? Fine. But there are also going to be problems in the exam, like the next 3 problems, so 7, 8, and 9 in the week 14 activity, that are going to be a little bit more complicated. So we sort of noted in a lot of cases, just in those first couple, that we could also sort of characterize the argument as committing a logical fallacy, right? That's making a logical mistake in addition to the bias. And very commonly, that's what you're actually going to find in real world scenarios out there with actual human beings who you're talking to. And indeed within ourselves too. I mean, we also will find that when we find ourselves making a logical fallacy, the reason will frequently be because one of these biases within ourselves as well. So the other kind of problem you're going to get in the exam is going to basically ask you to combine those two things. Identify the fallacy and then identify the bias that's sort of leading to it, come up with a way of responding. It might be helpful for this portion if you go to the week 14 post-class assignments. There's two study guides for the exam, and one of them is a list of every possible fallacy that's sort of fair game for the exam. It might be helpful to print that out when you're filling this out, when you're doing the homework problems, when you're studying, and indeed you can even use it on the exam itself. It's just a list of all the sort of possible fallacies that are fair game. So for this other kind of problem, 7, 8, 9, you have to do three things. You have to identify the fallacy and then sort of give a brief explanation of why the fallacy is being committed. You have to identify the bias, again, give a brief explanation of why the bias is committed, one sentence or so for both of those. And then you have to come up with a response to both of them that doesn't just respond to the logical fallacy, that also sort of deals with, in some sense, the bias that's underlying why that fallacy was originally committed. I mean, you all probably have experience with this, right? Just telling someone, walking up to someone and being like, well, that's the straw person fallacy, hardy, her. Like, that's not going to get a great response. What needs to be done is almost address why that logical mistake was getting made in the first place in like the real world. And this is a chance to sort of practice that a little bit. How can we come up with sort of like a real world kind of responses to instances of logical fallacies that we see? So does anyone just have any sort of initial questions? All right, then let's turn to the last three problems then on this activity. Let's go back to the whiteboard. So take a minute, at least for now. Why don't you just at least try it for number 7, figure out what fallacy is being committed here, and also figure out what bias seems to also being evidenced here. So do that at least. We'll go through maybe the response together collectively. All right, so first, what fallacy do we see here? We see the slippery slope fallacy. It's very unlikely that taking care of a crying baby will lead to the bad outcome of the baby ending up in prison. And indeed, it's so almost ridiculously unlikely that like it's why would someone ever make such a mistake? Well, okay, it seems like they're making it because of a cognitive bias, right? In this case, this person seems to have a very strong memory of their brother being spoiled when they were young, and that leading to negative outcomes, right? That leading the person to going to prison. That's sort of an example of the availability and vividness bias. The speaker in this case is giving too much weight to a particularly vivid and vibrant memory that they have. And that seems to be why the person is sort of falling in to this logical mistake in this case. And so if we want to actually correct the logical mistake, we're also going to have to sort of acknowledge why that logical mistake is taking place. And so we could respond maybe something like this. There's different responses you can give. Obviously, this is just sort of one kind of example of something that maybe would be sensible in this case. But maybe, you know, we could acknowledge that the person has had this experience, take it seriously, right? You know, I know your experience with your brother was really, really important and painful. And I agree that it's a bad idea to spoil our child. But just taking care of him when he cries isn't going to spoil him and isn't going to lead to the same thing happening that happened to your brother. This response sort of hits both sides. It's not just the sort of like smart alecky internet, like, well, that's a slippery slope fallacy, ha ha ha, right? That's not going to work. It sort of addresses both the logical mistake that's being made and also why that mistake is being made, the bias that's sort of motivating the logical error, right? We sort of, at the first half, we sort of like acknowledge and recognize that the experience was there, that it's an important one, and that maybe there are even things to be learned from that experience, but that there's also sort of a logical error going on here, and the cases aren't as similar as being presented. Something like that. Again, you didn't have to write this exactly, but something of that sort, something that's responding to both the fallacy and the bias. That's what I'm going to be looking for in these problems. Any questions on this one? All right, then let's turn to number 8. All right, so this example, if any of you are fans of The Office anyway, I always sort of think of this example as the Michael Scott example. Right here, we have a very clear logical fallacy, the red herring fallacy. Right? The how good the company is, or how good the products of the company. And its customer service are, has basically nothing to do with the issue of raises, right? Whether or not the employees should get raises or not. So just a distraction tactic, right? Now, okay, why is this distraction tactic taking place? Well, maybe it's just simply as a distraction tactic, right? Maybe it could well be the case that you have a boss that just uses fallacious arguments to get their employees to go along with stuff. Fine, that's possible. But here it seems like there's something a little bit more going on than just that. Here we seem to have what's called the identification with beliefs. Right? The manager is someone who, that it seems to be really important to them that people think that they're a good boss and that the company is a good company. And as a result, they seem to be unwilling to sort of like recognize things that make both of those things not true, or at least challenge whether or not they really are a good boss or whether or not the company really is a good company. And that would sort of was what's leading to the irrelevant stuff being brought up, right? Because it's sort of stuff that makes them look good. It makes him look good, makes the company look good, right? And so again, you'd have to sort of like hit both sides of it, right? Like, so maybe some sort of response like this, maybe, right? Like if the company is as good as you're saying it is, shouldn't we, the employees, get raises for all of our good work? And again, we sort of like do double duty here. We respond to the logical fallacy, we reorient the conversation back to the actual issue, which is raises. So we turn things back to where they actually should be. And we also sort of like are trying to get the manager to recognize the sort of almost like cognitive dissonance or whatever that they're not willing to look at, right? That their belief of themselves as a good boss and the company as a good company is kind of at odds, in fact, with the fact that their employees never get raises. All right. How are we doing here, people? Any questions, thoughts, comments with this one? All right, then let's do the last one. Let's look at number 9. All right, so let's do this last one. So here, what logical fallacy do we see? The post hoc fallacy, very clearly. The only connection that's being drawn between the bird and the computer crash is the fact that the bird flew by before the computer crash. Right. And in this case, a bird flying by isn't even really a credible candidate for why a computer could crash. And again, that seems almost obvious, so why would someone ever make this mistake in the first place? Here, it's because of what gets called confirmation bias. This is our tendency, again, a feature of how our brains work, to sort of only look for evidence or only accept evidence that confirms some hypothesis, right? It's basically the reason why we don't change our beliefs all the time, is because we sort of like, it's harder to move us off of something. Where that's dangerous is what you sort of like got on in the first place isn't sensible. We see here the confirmation bias is taking place in that the person is only remembering times when they had bad experiences with animals. And the important thing is they're only remembering experiences that confirm their thesis that animals are bad luck. But presumably, this person has had thousands of experiences with animals that didn't lead to anything bad happening, right? They're just overlooking all of those memories, they're overlooking all of that evidence. And so the response again sort of needs to do both. It needs to point out that the post hoc fallacy is just kind of silly, that there's no real credible cause being posited here, while also saying, yeah, you're probably forgetting a whole bunch of experiences. You're not looking at all the available evidence, right? So maybe a response to something like this. But I'm sure you've had lots of experiences with animals that didn't go bad. And if you know this person, maybe give an example. It's probably just a coincidence in those cases, like in this case of the computer. And again, you sort of hit both sides. You hit the logical fallacy side. This is just a coincidence. And you sort of are sort of trying to get the person to remember things that because of the confirmation bias, they'd be reticent to remember on their own. So you sort of hit both sides of it again. All right. Any last questions with number 9? All right, then that's a good place for us to end it. Kind of for the semester, actually. What I'll do next week, I will post a video probably on Wednesday or so, early next week. That's just sort of an end of the semester little thing. We'll have a few little final thoughts, maybe go over the final exam a little bit. That'll just be posted to Canvas like normal. And otherwise, yeah, we don't have any more scheduled meetings. I'll have office hours next week like normal. You can also make an appointment with me if you want to go over any of this material during when we would have had class normally. So basically Wednesday or Friday from 11 to noon. You can also make an appointment with me. I'll always be available during those times. Otherwise, thank you all very much for all your good work in the semester. I know this semester has been a rough one in a lot of different ways. We're doing a lot of difficult things this semester. I mean, this certainly isn't the way that I would have wanted to have run this class. But I would actually love to hear from you all, because it looks like spring semester is going to look pretty similar to this one. Hopefully that'll be it. But at least spring semester looks like it's also going to have more or less the same structure. I'd love to hear from you all using the course surveys, which should be available in Canvas. What sort of worked and what didn't work from this sort of hybrid structure that we're using this semester. I'm going to be using it again next semester too. So I'd love to hear from you what worked, what didn't work, what could be improved, how could I make it flow better. Get recommendations, criticisms, suggestions. That would be super helpful to me. So I'll send out a couple of reminders about that maybe. Thank you all very much for all the good work. One last video. Have a wonderful break, everyone. And enjoy. I'll talk to you later. I can stick around to chat for a minute or two if anyone would like to.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Absolutely. You as well.
Thanks. Have a good break.
You as well. Bye.